I spent 17 years with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources before I understood that some things in our forests are not supposed to exist. What I found in the Uinta Mountains during the winter of 2019 changed everything I thought I knew about apex predators and territorial behavior. The official report called it an abandoned elk kill site with unusual scavenger activity. What I documented in my personal notes tells a very different story. I'm sharing this now because people deserve to know what might be living in those mountains, even if my former employers would prefer I stay silent. My name is Sarah Kendrick. I worked as a wildlife officer in northeastern Utah, managing a territory that covered over 800 square miles of mountain wilderness. Most of my work involved routine patrols, checking hunting licenses, monitoring elk and deer populations, and responding to occasional reports of problem bears or mountain lions. I had encountered every predator native to Utah. I thought I understood the natural order of things in those mountains. I was wrong. In early February 2019, I received a call from a hunting outfitter who operated in the high country near the Wyoming border. He reported finding multiple elk carcasses in an area where he'd been guiding clients for over 20 years. The kills were unusual, he said. The pattern was wrong. The consumption didn't match bear or mountain lion behavior. He wanted someone from Wildlife Resources to document the site before the next storm buried everything under fresh snow. I drove out the following morning. The access road was barely passable, snow-packed and icy from weeks of winter weather. I met the outfitter, a man named Tom Grayson, at a trailhead about 40 miles from the nearest town. He was in his 60s, weathered and practical, not the type to exaggerate or imagine things. He seemed genuinely disturbed by what he'd found. We snowshoed in about 3 miles, following a drainage that cut through dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen. The temperature was in the low 20s, the air so cold it hurt to breathe deeply. Tom didn't say much during the hike. He kept scanning the tree line with the kind of alertness you develop after decades in the wilderness. I asked him what exactly he'd seen. He just shook his head and said I needed to see it for myself. The first carcass was a cow elk, maybe 400 pounds when alive. It lay in a small clearing surrounded by dense timber. The snow around it was heavily disturbed, trampled, and stained dark. The elk's neck was broken, not torn or bitten through like a mountain lion kill, but broken cleanly. The head twisted at an angle that suggested massive force applied with precision. The rib cage was crushed, the bones splintered inward. The feeding pattern was methodical. The choicest muscle groups had been consumed first, then the organs, then portions of the hide and extremities. What disturbed me immediately was the lack of typical scavenger activity. No ravens, no magpies, no coyote tracks in the surrounding snow. The forest was silent in that heavy way that signals predator presence. Animals knew something dangerous had been here, and they were staying away. Tom walked me to the second carcass about 100 yards away. Another cow elk, killed and consumed in exactly the same manner, the neck broken, the ribs crushed, the feeding pattern identical. Then a third carcass another 100 yards beyond that. Same pattern, same methodology. I had never seen anything like it. I began documenting the site with photographs and measurements. The tracks in the snow told a story I didn't want to believe. Large canine prints, but wrong in subtle ways. The pad structure was too elongated. The toe spread was unusual. And most disturbing, the tracks showed clear bipedal locomotion. Whatever made these prints had walked upright through the snow, leaving a stride length of over 5 feet. I found other tracks showing quadrupedal movement, all 4 limbs on the ground, suggesting the creature could switch between walking upright and running on all 4s. The depth of the prints indicated something very heavy, probably over 300 pounds. I took plaster casts of the clearest impressions, my hands shaking despite the thick gloves I wore. Tom stood watch while I worked, his rifle unslung and ready. He told me he'd been coming to these mountains since he was a boy. He'd seen bears, mountain lions, wolves when they were still around. This was none of those things. The way the elk had been killed required strength beyond any predator he knew. And the tracks, he said quietly, looked like something walking on 2 legs with a dog's feet. I wanted to dismiss his assessment. I wanted to find a rational explanation. But the evidence spoke for itself. Something with enormous strength and apparent intelligence had killed 3 elk in a confined area, consumed them methodically, and moved between the kill sites on two legs. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something else. Tree bark had been stripped at about 7 feet high on several trunks surrounding the clearing. The wood beneath showed deep gouges, parallel lines that looked like claw marks. Whatever made those marks had been tall enough to reach well above my head and strong enough to tear through living wood like it was paper. Tom said he'd found more. He led me another quarter-mile through the forest to an area where the terrain dropped into a shallow ravine. Here, sheltered from wind and partially hidden by deadfall timber, we found what could only be described as a den site. The ground was trampled and cleared of snow in a rough circle about 15 feet across. There were more tracks, more claw marks on surrounding trees, and something that made my stomach drop. Bones. Not just elk bones, but the remains of deer, smaller mammals, and something that looked disturbingly like it might have come from a bear cub. The bones were arranged in piles, deliberately stacked rather than scattered randomly. This suggested organization, planning, behavior that went beyond simple predation. Tom pointed to marks on some of the bones, score lines that indicated they'd been gnawed and then broken open to extract marrow. The pattern of consumption showed efficiency and thoroughness that I'd never seen in wild predators. We found evidence of at least 3 distinct sets of tracks in the den area, different sizes suggesting adults and possibly juveniles. The implications hit me hard. This wasn't a lone predator. This was a family group or pack, hunting together, denning together, exhibiting social organization that matched wolves, but with creatures that were clearly something else. I spent another hour documenting everything. The photographs, the measurements, the plaster casts, all of it went into my field report. But even as I recorded the data, I knew this wouldn't be received well. Wildlife resources dealt with known species, established behaviors, recognized threats. What I was documenting fell outside those categories entirely. Tom asked me what I thought we were dealing with. I told him the truth. I didn't know. The evidence suggested a large canine predator with the ability to walk upright, hunt cooperatively, and demonstrate problem-solving intelligence beyond typical animal behavior. But no such creature was recognized by science or wildlife management. Officially, it didn't exist. We hiked back to the trailhead as afternoon light began to fade. The temperature was dropping fast and fresh snow was starting to fall. Tom said he wouldn't be bringing clients into this area anymore, not until he understood what was out here. I didn't blame him. I wasn't sure I wanted to come back either. That evening, I sat in my truck reviewing the photographs on my camera. The images showed exactly what I'd seen in person: the broken elk, the unusual tracks, the claw marks too high on the trees. But photographs don't capture the feeling of a place, the oppressive silence, the sense of being watched by something that understood you were there. I filed my report the next morning. I described the elk kills in detail, documented the unusual tracks and feeding patterns, and included my photographs and measurements. I carefully avoided speculation about what might have made the kills. I presented the evidence and recommended further investigation. The response from my supervisor was swift and disappointing. He called me into his office 2 days later and told me the report was being classified as a bear kill site with possible wolf activity. The unusual aspects I'd documented were attributed to difficult terrain and snow conditions that might have distorted the tracks. He suggested I was overthinking what was likely a routine predation event. I tried to argue. I showed him the plaster casts, pointed out the bipedal stride length, explained the claw marks at 7 feet high. He listened politely, then told me the matter was closed. Wildlife resources would not be investigating further. The site would be monitored remotely via trail cameras, but no additional fieldwork was authorized. I couldn't let it go. The evidence was too clear, too disturbing to simply file away and forget. I began researching similar reports from other states, looking for patterns that might explain what I'd found. What I discovered was both validating and terrifying. Wildlife officers, hunters, and outdoor professionals across the western United States had documented similar findings. Unusual predation patterns, bipedal canine tracks, evidence of cooperative hunting by something that wasn't wolf or bear. Most of these reports had been dismissed or suppressed, classified as misidentifications or anomalies, not worthy of official investigation. I made contact with a retired Forest Service ranger from Wyoming who had documented nearly identical findings in the Bridger Wilderness 3 years earlier. He'd found elk kills with broken necks and crushed rib cages, tracks showing bipedal movement, and evidence of multiple creatures operating together. His reports had been similarly dismissed. He told me something that stayed with me. He said the official refusal to investigate wasn't incompetence or skepticism, it was policy. Acknowledging an unknown apex predator in public recreation areas would create liability issues that no agency wanted to face. Against official guidance, I returned to the den site in late March. The snow had melted enough to reveal more details that winter conditions had hidden. I found more bones, more evidence of long-term occupation, and something that confirmed my worst suspicions: fresh tracks. Whatever had been using this area was still active, still hunting, still denning in that remote ravine. I set up trail cameras at strategic locations around the site, positioning them to capture movement through the main approaches. I used my own equipment and didn't log the camera placements through official channels. If wildlife resources wouldn't investigate properly, I would document this myself. The footage I collected over the following weeks defied easy explanation. The cameras captured something moving through the forest at night, something large and upright that moved with fluid grace between the trees. The thermal imaging camera I'd positioned showed a heat signature consistent with a large mammal, but the locomotion was wrong. It walked on 2 legs with a stride that covered ground faster than any human could move. One clip showed the creature approaching an elk carcass in darkness. The image quality wasn't perfect, but I could make out a powerful body covered in dark fur, arms that hung longer than human proportions, and a head that appeared canine even in the low-resolution footage. The creature fed for several minutes, then stood upright to its full height, easily over 7 feet tall, and looked directly at the camera. The eyes reflected the infrared light with an amber glow. Then it turned and walked away into the forest, moving on 2 legs until it disappeared from frame. I showed the footage to Tom. He watched it 3 times without speaking, then asked me what I planned to do with it. I told him I didn't know. Releasing it publicly would invite ridicule and probably cost me my job. Keeping it private meant people would continue hiking and camping in areas where something dangerous was hunting. There was no good option. In May, I received a report of a missing hiker in the high Uintas, about 15 miles from the den site I'd been monitoring. A 28-year-old man from Salt Lake City had gone backpacking alone and failed to return when expected. Search and rescue teams found his campsite abandoned, his gear scattered, and drag marks leading into dense timber. The official search lasted 5 days before being called off due to dangerous terrain and lack of leads. The case was classified as a presumed wilderness accident with remains possibly consumed by scavengers. I obtained permission to examine the campsite after the official search ended. What I found made my blood run cold. The drag marks showed bipedal tracks, the same pattern I'd documented at the den site. The hiker's tent had been torn open with such force that the support poles were bent and broken. His food cache, hung properly from a tree branch, had been pulled down, but not from below. The branch itself had been broken off at a height of 9 feet. Something had climbed or reached up to tear the entire branch down rather than simply pulling the rope. I followed the drag marks into the timber as far as I could safely go alone. About 100 yards from the campsite, I found a boot, just one, torn and damaged, with biological material still inside that I didn't examine closely. The surrounding area showed signs of a struggle: broken branches, disturbed earth, and that same heavy silence that I'd learned to associate with predator presence. I reported my findings through official channels, carefully documenting everything without speculation. The response was predictable. My supervisor told me the search and rescue team had already examined the area thoroughly. My additional observations would be noted, but didn't change the classification of the incident. The hiker had presumably fallen, been injured, and succumbed to the elements. Wildlife scavenging explained the scattered gear and remains, but I knew what I'd seen. The drag marks didn't show someone injured and crawling. They showed someone being pulled, moved by something strong enough to drag a full-grown man through rough terrain. The torn tent, the broken tree branch, The boot with its terrible contents all pointed to predation by something powerful and intelligent. I began having conversations with other wildlife officers across the Mountain West, carefully feeling out whether they'd encountered similar situations. What I learned was disturbing. Several officers had documented unusual predation events, unexplained disappearances, and physical evidence that didn't match known predators. All of them had been told to classify their findings as routine wildlife activity. All of them had been discouraged from further investigation. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to avoid acknowledging something that everyone at the field level knew was real. One officer from Montana told me about a case involving a hunting party that had been stalked for 2 days by something they never clearly saw. They reported hearing vocalizations that sounded partly human, finding tracks that showed bipedal movement, and feeling constantly watched by something in the surrounding forest. When they finally abandoned their hunt and hiked out early, they found claw marks on their truck that had been left while they were away. Deep gouges in the metal that couldn't have been made by any bear. Their report was filed as an encounter with an aggressive grizzly, despite their insistence that what stalked them was not a bear. By summer, I'd collected enough evidence and testimony to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. There was something living in the high country of the western mountains, something that hunted cooperatively, demonstrated intelligence beyond typical predators, and showed no fear of humans. Whether it was an undiscovered species, a rare cryptid population, or something else entirely, I couldn't say. But it was real, it was dangerous, and it was being systematically ignored by the agencies responsible for public safety. I made the decision to document everything I'd learned and preserve it outside official channels. I copied my photographs, my footage, my field notes, and the testimony from other officers I'd interviewed. I stored multiple copies in different locations, including with Tom, who agreed to keep the information secure. If something happened to me, or if the evidence was confiscated, there would still be a record of what I'd found. In September, I returned to the den site one final time. I wanted to see if it was still being used, if the creatures I'd been tracking were still active in that area. What I found was both relief and new concern. The den had been abandoned. The ground showed no recent activity, no fresh tracks, no new kills in the surrounding forest. Whatever had been living there had moved on. But I also found evidence that suggested where they might have gone. I discovered tracks leading higher into the mountains, toward more remote areas where human activity was almost non-existent. The tracks showed the same bipedal pattern, the same size and stride length I'd documented before. But now there were more of them, suggesting the family group or pack had grown, or multiple groups had merged. The implications were clear. These creatures were adapting, moving away from areas where they had been documented, seeking more isolated territories. They were learning, changing their patterns in response to human awareness. That kind of adaptive behavior suggested intelligence that made them far more dangerous than any simple predator. I left the Wildlife Service in November of 2019. The official reason was personal considerations and career change. The real reason was that I could no longer work for an agency that refused to acknowledge what I knew existed in the forests we were supposed to manage. I couldn't keep sending hikers and hunters into areas where something was hunting without warning them of the potential danger. Since leaving, I've continued monitoring reports from the Uinta Mountains and surrounding wilderness areas. There have been 3 more missing person cases in the high country over the past few years, all classified as wilderness accidents, all involving experienced outdoors people who should have known better than to put themselves in danger. The official explanations involve falls, exposure, and wildlife scavenging. But the pattern is there for anyone willing to see it. I still have the trail camera footage, the plaster casts of the tracks, the photographs of the den site, and the kill patterns. I've shown them to a few researchers and cryptozoologists who take such things seriously. Their assessments vary, but most agree that the evidence points toward something unknown operating in those mountains, something that combines the physical capabilities of large predators with problem-solving intelligence that approaches or exceeds other apex species. Tom still outfits in the Uintas, but he's changed his routes and won't take clients into certain areas anymore. He's had his own experiences since that winter day when we documented the den site. He's heard vocalizations that didn't match any known animal. He's found more unusual tracks and more elk kills with that distinctive broken neck pattern. He doesn't talk about it with his clients, but he's learned which areas to avoid. I think about that missing hiker sometimes, the young man who went into the mountains alone and never came back. I think about what he must have experienced in those final moments when something powerful and intelligent found him in his tent. I think about whether a warning could have saved him, whether public acknowledgement of what lives in those mountains might prevent future tragedies. But I also understand the impossible position that creates. How do you warn people about a threat that officially doesn't exist? How do you protect the public from something that science refuses to recognize? The answers aren't simple, and the consequences of speaking out publicly are severe for anyone who tries. What I can do is share what I learned, document what I found, and the hope that eventually enough evidence accumulates that the official denial becomes impossible to maintain. Until then, I live with the knowledge that something is out there in the high country, something that hunts in family groups, demonstrates territorial intelligence, and has learned to avoid human detection while still operating in areas where people camp and hike. The Uinta Mountains are beautiful, remote, and dangerous in ways that go beyond the recognized hazards of weather and terrain. I spent 17 years working in those mountains, thinking I understood the natural order, the predators and prey, the balance of wilderness ecosystems. What I discovered in that winter of 2019 showed me how incomplete our understanding really is. If you spend time in the high country of Utah or any of the remote mountain ranges of the West, be aware that you're not alone out there. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Pay attention to unusual silence in the forest, to the absence of normal wildlife activity. Don't camp alone in extremely remote areas, and don't dismiss signs that suggest predator presence just because they don't match what you expect from bears or mountain lions. The den site I found was just one location in hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The tracks leading away suggested these creatures range across vast territories, possibly moving between states, utilizing terrain too rough and remote for regular human access. They're out there, hunting, denning, raising young, maintaining populations that we've failed to document or acknowledge. I don't know if sharing this information will make any difference. I don't know if people will believe what I documented or if it will be dismissed like every other report that's been filed and forgotten. But I needed to tell someone what I found in those mountains, what I photographed and measured and tried to report through official channels, only to be told it didn't matter. The truth matters. What lives in our wilderness matters. And the people who venture into those wild places deserve to know what might be watching them from the shadows between the trees.